नमस्कार, सत श्री अकाल, राम राम सा, हमारी वड़क्कम प्रणाम। आप सभी का ऑल्टरनेट मीडिया में फिर से स्वागत है। हमारे साथ जुड़े हुए हैं रियर एडमिरल मोंटी खन्ना सर फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम एंड आई एम रियली ऑनर्ड टू हैव यू सर ऑन बोर्ड टुडे. It's my honor and pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Gayatri. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And very good
जी,
evening to all your audience.
जी. So, Monty Khanna sir, he was commissioned in the Indian Navy in the year 1983. During his formative years, he has won Best Naval Cadet and Sword of Honor. Sir commanded submarines Sindhu Vijay and frigate Krishna and Gomti. Sir was naval attaché, Embassy of India, Washington, D.C. He was also appointed as Assistant Chief of Naval Staff. He's been Commandant of the Naval War College. He was the Chief Instructor in Defense Services Staff College till he retired in 2019. Then, Sir was also Assistant Military Advisor to the National Security Council Secretariat, Delhi. Sir is a graduate of Defense Services Staff College, Wellington, and Naval War College. Sir has a huge, I would say, experience and expertise when it comes to Navy. Sir, we are not taking the Navy's talk today because we just changed. Something very interesting came. Sir keeps writing for a lot of international and national organizations. And in one of his articles, he has written about the undersea cables, and it caught my eye because undersea cables are very, very important. First of all, what are these? Because a lot of us might not even know. So, what are undersea cables?
So basically, undersea cables are cables that run from one cable landing station to another cable landing station on the bottom of the sea, along the seabed. They can be used, actually, they go back a long way. You know, in the old days when before the wireless was invented by Marconi, all telegrams, etc., that used to go from one continent to the other, let's say from Europe to the US, etc., used to travel by undersea. These cables were laid down from one continent to the other so that telegraphic traffic could be transmitted on these cables. They can also be used for transmitting power, for example. You know, if you have power that has to, electricity which has to flow from one location on an island to another, say on the mainland, then also you can place an undersea cable along the seabed. But today, this connotation has totally changed because today we have these fiber optic cables that move from one continent and one cable landing station to the other. And when you think about the internet, you normally think that your internet traffic is going on satellites. It's wrong. 97% of all internet traffic, which is going from one location to the other, flows on undersea cables. So this requirement is really critical. All your data, which moves all your financial transactions, all your services that happens, the vast majority of them are flowing on undersea cables.
So, how are these cables laid down? Because they're very curious. Seas are deep, they're very huge water, so much of water pressure. How are these laid down? And what are the specialities required to maintain these cables under the sea and in a safe and secure way?
So let's talk about data cables. That is the fiber optic cables here. Now, typically, to lay them from one place to another, you require a cable laying ship. These are specially designed ships, and they have it's a ship which has a large, turntable on top, uh, and on that the cable is wound. Hundreds of kilometers of cable is wound on that, and these ships are large. They can displace more than 10, 15,000 tons, 20,000 tons displacement. So from the cable landing station, you have to these because there's not enough water depth over there. The ship cannot come close to the cable landing station. You get a boat or something that attaches the cable to the cable landing station, and then you attach it to the ship. And as the ship moves, it keeps releasing this cable. So it's not buoyant, so it goes down to the sea. It sinks to the seabed. Now it's not enough to keep it on the seabed because especially in shallower waters, you have ships with anchors, you have fishing traffic which sometimes use bottom trawls. They can rip out these cables and do a lot of damage because the cables are hugely expensive. So for the first up to a depth of around 1,000 meters and sometimes more, these cables have to be embedded in the seabed. So you have a plow which digs a trench, This is also these are all highly automated gadgets. They are lowered onto the seabed by the cabling ship, and either using water pressure or a mechanical plow, they plow and they make a trench, and that cable is laid inside the trench, and then that trench is covered, with mud. So that way, the cable gets protected against any surface obstruction, a natural obstruction that might be there. Someone drops an anchor by mistake, a fishing boat is, trawling over there. So for these sort of obstructions, you protect them that way. You also can also armor these cables. So these cables have got a metal jacket with a flexible wire, so they get armored. And until you reach very high depths, because once you reach much deeper depths, then there's no requirement to armor them. And so you save cost. You decide, as to which are the areas which are vulnerable, and you protect them by putting a metallic jacket and by embedding them in the seabed up to a certain area, and thereafter they are laid on the seabed. So that's the way they run from one station to the other. Now, the traffic that flows on these cables, it tends to attenuate. Even light, when it's flowing on cables, it'll flow for around 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers, and then it starts attenuating. So you have to have repeaters which sort of amplify the signals and make sure it goes over again. These amplifiers have to be powered. So you have a powering arrangement that also passes through these cables. So they're quite complex, with lots of, some places you have to split them because the same cable will go, and then you have to split them, one going to one continent and one heading to the other continent. So all this is done, deep below the ocean bed. And it's quite fascinating as to the amount of technology that has gone into it. But it is absolutely essential. I mean, today, if you see, uh, our services export now, I think last year were $320 billion. The vast majority of that is flowing on undersea cables, the vast majority in terms of data traffic, in terms of, services, invoicing, financial transactions every day to the tune of $10 trillion on a daily basis flow on undersea cables. So you can just imagine this is truly critical infrastructure and therefore has to be protected.
So this is fascinating. And how are, like, if what about repairs and all with so much complexities? I mean, you will need special teams, special people who are highly trained in these matters to go under the sea, deep into the at the bottom of the floor of the sea, and then repair if any kind of issues happen. I think recently we
Yeah,
did
so you
notice
have
some kind of issues that had come up 2 3 months back.
these are a very specialized job to repair these undersea cables. In India, for example, we have a total of currently 17 undersea cables, which come in 16 cable landing stations, which are the vast majority of them around is along 6 kilometers of coastline near Versova, near Bombay, where the vast majority are landed. From time to time, these cables have a defect. The defect can be either because someone has anchored on top of it, or a trawl has, gone deeper than they might have not have been embedded, entrenched to an adequate depth. So, a trawl has come and ripped it out. Or you can have, in times of combat or in times of, stress, there are certain cases where ships have deliberately adopted some measures to sever cables. In the Baltic, for example, you had 13 incidences, I think, in the past year or so of disruption of undersea cables, and a large part of them, it can't be a coincidence that suddenly you have 13 incidences. So they're saying there's some deliberate actions taken by certain vessels who drop their anchor and drag their anchor over a certain distance and rip out cables as they're going past. Now, if you want to repair a cable, uh, these depths are enormous, 5 6,000 meters at times. You can't send people down there. So normally you send remotely operated vessels. These are, like uh, they are small undersea robots, you can say, which have got a tether and you can control them. So you take them down. Now you have to firstly bring that cable on top. So how do you bring that cable on top? Uh, to bring the cable on top, actually you have to first cut the cable. So you, even if it is damaged or you have a problem, the first thing you do is cut the cable. And then through these ROVs, you attach floats to the two ends. And with these floats, what happens? They come up and they surface on top. And thereafter, once they come to the surface, then you identify what the problem is. and you fix that problem. Whether it requires it's a powering arrangement, or whether it's a repeater which has got a problem, so you fix that problem. And once you've done that, then you splice a joint. You have a length of cable that you splice from one end to the other end. And thereafter, once you establish that you've got connectivity all the way through, you lower the cable back into the seabed. So this is a process. It is a highly complex process. It is a highly technical process. You require a ship that has got a lot of facilities to do it, a specialized cable repair ship. You require trained staff to be able to do that. And once it is done, of course, you restore the traffic, and then you make sure that, then you lower it back onto the seabed. So that is a rough process by which you undertake the repair of undersea cables.
Right. So, how critical are the undersea cable networks important for India's economy and infrastructure? Like,
So
if we
again, as I mentioned, yeah, that 23, 24, $320 billion was our services exports. Vast majority of that flowing on undersea cables. If you see our trade, the services is exports are growing much faster than our merchandise exports. The estimation is by I think 2030, which is not too far away, another 4 or 5 years away, our services exports are going to be in the region of around $620 billion. It was actually not 320, it was $340 billion last year. $620 billion, and the large part of that is, the vast majority, you can say, is flowing on these cables. So these cables are critical, absolutely critical, and any disruption. It's now, of course, we've got redundancies. The cables we have, even 17, and three more are being laid this year. So our capacities are going to significantly increase by the end of this year. It'll be 20 cables. Well, some will be retired also, because the cables have got a finite life, and once they reach that the end of life, then after that some deterioration takes place, and you retire them. Modern day cables, what happens is that because of developments that have taken place in fiber optic technology, you can have a large number of cores in a single cable. You can have multiple strands of fiber optics that are going through, and therefore they can carry enormous amounts of data, and you build up your redundancy by that. So even if you lose a cable or two, you can redirect that traffic through other cables so that your services are not interrupted, but up to a point. If you lose multiple cables beyond a certain point, then you run into a problem. So you have to make sure that your cables are protected, and that for that you have to do a variety of things.
Very interesting. So, what are the main vulnerabilities in India's current undersea cable network? What are the main weak
So
areas, weak points?
Yeah, weak areas are, firstly, we don't have enough. It's enough to serve our requirement right now, and there is a move to sort of expand it. But we are responsible, if I'm not mistaken, I think I have the figures over here. 20% of all global internet traffic is, generated from India, right? That's a pretty large
20%.
number, yeah.
That's
Yes,
huge.
20%.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
20%.
yeah. And we have only 3% of the world's undersea cables. So there's a mismatch, over here, that Singapore we've got, as I mentioned, 17 undersea cables, and it's going to go up to 20 by the end of this year, hopefully. Singapore by itself has got 26 undersea cables. Tiny Singapore, yeah, has got 26 undersea cables. So you can see that, while the capacities are adequate to meet our requirement, but the way the amount of internet traffic is growing exponentially, people are saying that our requirements in the next 10 years is going to be 10 times what we have today. So first, we need many more cables. If you have many more cables, you have greater redundancy also. Even if you have a defect, even if someone takes out a cable deliberately, a cable or two, if you have greater redundancy, you're not going to you're not going to start curtailing services. But if so, you need that greater redundancy. Uh, we've got another vulnerability that the vast majority of our cables are going into a very small section of our coastline, 6 kilometers north of Bombay's Versova, where I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 7 or 8 cables are coming in that area itself. That creates, if you don't have geographic dispersion over the entire continental India, it creates a single point vulnerability over there. Supposing a ship comes and drags an anchor right through that entire area and severs all 6, 7 cables, you've got a problem on your hands then, because your vulnerability I mean, you can reroute, and you have, up to a certain point. But if you have cascading multiple cables getting severed at the same time, then you'll soon reach a point where you have to start curtailing services. And once you start curtailing, then there's a cost associated with curtailing services. The other vulnerability we have is that we don't have our own cable repair ship. So what typically happens, all these large cable operators, if you take Geo, if you take, Tata Telecom, if you take Airtel, etc., they are, cables are typically owned, as a consortiums that you have, consortiums. But what happens is, in case you have a problem and you need to get it repaired, most of them have tie-ups with two companies. One is the Dubai-based and one is Singapore-based, for cable who operate cable repair services. So once you have a problem, you raise an indent on them. You might have a standing arrangement with them, but you have a raise an indent. Then they have to see whether the ship is available. If the ship is available, the ship requires a finite amount of time to traverse from wherever the ship is to come to the location where the problem arises. Then there are issues regarding, security clearances, etc. The MHA has got certain, or the DOT has got certain rules that there has to be at least an Indian national embarked on that ship. The crew has to be security cleared. So lots of things have to come into play before the cable repair process can start, and then the cable repair takes place. So, I mean, if you ask industry, they'll say even though the cable repair job is only around maybe a week or to 10 days, this entire period can stretch from 3 to 6 months before the defect is rectified. For the ship to be made available, for the ship to come over there, for the security clearances to be done, and for the work to start and be completed. Now, this sort of a disruption for 5 6 months, if you cost it, is quite substantial. And therefore, it is imperative for us to develop a domestic capability for cable repair, where we have our own flagged vessel that, which is capable of doing this job. So this is work in progress. I know that the government is already sort of working towards this direction. And the earlier we can stand up this capability, the better it will be for us as a nation.
So we need to have our own ships more and more. Not only the repair ships, but also the merchant ships and also the submarines and other things. But coming to the next question, what are the major security threats? Now, this is the vulnerability, the weak areas, the things we are lacking. But what are the major security threats when it comes to these undersea cables and the networks?
Yeah, so undersea cables, I mean, one is, of course, there's a cyber threat. So, that cyber, of course, if someone can intrude into your systems and put some spyware or disrupt it, and thereafter, so there is a system-based threat that can come into play. Uh, uh, the second major threat, I would say, is the physical threat, that if someone deliberately severs your cables, right? So these
Like you mentioned
cables
in the
traverse.
Baltic, like you mentioned in the Baltics, the Baltic states that you mentioned.
Yeah. So that has happened recently. Like this new polar bear was a ship. They lowered its anchor and went through a certain area, disrupted one gas pipeline, one set of undersea cables that was used for traffic between Finland and I think, and on the other side, I think is Estonia, if I'm not mistaken. So all these things got numerous other incidents have taken place. Another more recent incident has happened between Taiwan, off Taiwan, where there's been a disruption again of undersea cables. In the past, there have been again in the Mediterranean, you have instances of disruption. So, I mean, it's very difficult, I mean, to pinpoint as to what is the reason. But nations are developing capabilities. Uh, Around a month and a half back, there was an article that came out about China developing a new cutting device for cutting cables that can operate in deep waters, much more efficient. Now, you can make the argument, of course, that you have to cut cables even to repair cables, that therefore but these are all dual use devices. So the dual use devices meaning in combat or in times of even short of combat, because you have some degree of deniability in this because no one knows. It's very difficult to identify who might have actually done this job. In that sense, you have to be cautious as to so the physical vulnerability is another sort of set of vulnerabilities that you have where someone can deliberately come and sever a cable, and then you're sort of trying to figure out how to get it repaired in a reasonable time frame. Apart from the cyber threat, yeah.
So what about our own about our own Indian Navy and research institutions? What role can they play in building domestic cable repair capacity? Because
So our ships, for example, we can ideally, of course, you should have a commercial ship that can undertake this task. Yeah. But a commercial ship for both cable laying and cable repair, it might take some time to stand up because you have to acquire a ship, you have to gain the expertise, you have to and then rehearse it a couple of times until you develop a certain amount of competence in doing that. But there are certain ships the Navy has got, like diving support ships, for example. Yeah, they've got these new ships that we are building. They're very capable ships, 7,000 tons in displacement. They've got dynamic position. What dynamic positioning is, whenever you want to repair a ship, deep waters, you can't anchor in those depths, say 3 kilometers depth. You can't use an anchor. So dynamic position means you bring the ship over there, and based on differential GPS, you have to maintain a static position. You can't let that ship drift, and you do it through thrusters. You've got these electronic thrusters that keep, getting a computer, switches them on and off so that the ship remains in one specific position continuously. And then these ships are equipped with autonomous undersea vessels, which you can, unmanned, which you can control and lower. They've got a moon pool, which is a cut, an opening in the center of the ship that allows you to lower these AUVs and take them wherever you want. You've got a large deck at the back. You've got a helicopter facility. You've got places that you can install equipment containers. You've got a large crane. So actually, a large part of the facilities required for rapidly, setting up an undersea repair capability are available on these ships. And I think there is a move right now that amongst the various other roles these ships have, their diving support, their submarine rescue, that even the repair of undersea cables to a finite amount, up to a certain degree, uh, they will in due course imbibe this capability. So at least in the near term, you can plug this vulnerability until we stand up our own large dedicated ship to undertake this task.
so you one of your articles you mentioned distributed acoustic sensing
Yeah.
techniques to enhance the security of the undersea cables. So what are these if we speak in very
Yeah.
simple
So
terms?
these distributed acoustic sensing is a new technique which is being introduced even commercially for if to identify it. It really may not be able to uh, to prevent, if someone is determined to slice a cable, but you will be able to identify the exact time and the location where that activity has taken place. So what happens is that you use light only, and if there is a source of noise, supposing there is a cable cutting device which is approaching a cable which is being dragged, or an anchor is being dragged, that generates a certain amount of vibration, it generates a certain amount of noise. And when the light in the FO cable is flowing from one place to the other, because of that vibration, there's a certain amount of backscatter of that light. That light sort of gets partially reflected back. And you can sense that backscatter. And you can sense that based on the light pulses which have gone, if you time it, you know at exactly what location that noise is being generated. So you use that noise to identify the point near the cable where an incident might be taking place. Then you have to correlate with the surface picture. So if all this is happening underwater, yeah, underwater you can't see. But obviously, if something is happening underwater by, let's say, a cable cutting device or an autonomous undersea vessel, these are they have to be supported by a surface ship. So then using other techniques like automatic identification system, you correlate and see ki, on the surface what is happening. Ki, is there any ship around over there near this? And once you correlate, then you can attach blame that, you are the person who's responsible for this. Then so it acts as a means of deterrence, because if a if a person who has come out with to do this with the hope that he doesn't get identified, now if you can identify the person who's done this, then through a name and shame campaign, or through dragging them to some international arbitration, etc., you can make things difficult for them. So it acts as a means of deterrence.
Right. So one of our very important things is risk of concentrated undersea cable networks around Mumbai. What is the solution for this
Yeah.
one? Because a lot part of it is If something happens in Mumbai, like, I know a lot of disruption takes place, you'll be losing in millions of dollars.
Yeah, so ideally you need to disperse, so companies will always do what is most profitable to them. If it is convenient, and if you find that the data centers are all located in Mumbai, and for distribution thereafter becomes easier, the cable landing stations are located over there, then they will do that. But if you're looking at it from a strategic standpoint, you cannot have this sort of vulnerabilities concentrated in a short part of your coastline. India has got 11,000 kilometers of coastline. So why should all our cables or a large part of them be within 6 kilometers out of 11,000 kilometers? There is a requirement to distribute it across the entire peninsula India. You know, at So I'm not saying right across, but you identify at least 10, 15 different locations where these cables can. You can set up cable landing stations where these cables can come. Now, to do that, you have to incentivize companies to do that. Because otherwise, for them, for the driver for a company is always cost. So if it's going to be more expensive to carry out some degree of distribution and dispersion, then you have to incentivize them to do that. So there are various means that either you introduce a part subsidy, or you look at ways and means, or other, some tax rebates, etc. If you go to certain states, to certain areas, that you can get if you distribute your services. So that way you can make it attractive for even private operators to distribute their cable landing stations across our coastline in different locations of Peninsula India.
So, can we build our resilience by increasing the load on the satellite based network internet?
Yeah, so this is something new. Initially, satellite services, you're all aware of, what Starlink, etc., is doing right now, OneWeb. So they're new, and the Chinese are setting up their own, and these are mega constellations. Starlink has got a license of, I think, some 12,000 satellites, and the second stage, they're saying they're going to go up to around 42,000 satellites. I mean, that is a sort of uh, earlier on, what used to happen is that for space-based internet services, you used to use geosynchronous satellites. Now, geosynchronous satellites are high up in orbit, 36,000 kilometers on top. And if you're going to use a geosynchronous satellite for, internet services, then there is a lag that happens, because these signals have to go all the way up there and then come all the way down wherever you are. And therefore, if I'm speaking to you, for example, if I say something, there will be a time lag, or there's what they call latency before you can respond, because that this time is fine. There's a finite amount of time required for that signal to reach the recipient and for them to respond. And for certain services, particularly financial services and all that, this sort of latency is not acceptable. So modern day constellations are all low Earth orbit. Yeah, they are 500 kilometers to 700 to 400 to 700 kilometers, and they're putting up these satellites in humongous numbers. But it's still expensive. I mean, even today, there's some reports which say that space-based internet services. Firstly, you have a bandwidth issue, and even there's a costing issue of at least between 50 to 100% more expensive than fiber optic cables, at least that much. And frankly, I don't see this gap getting bridged. Space is complex. It is good to have these services where fiber optic cables cannot reach, like in mid sea, for example, that you don't have internet based services over there. In difficult terrains like mountains and deserts in the middle of jungle, where you cannot lay down cables and towers, etc., from there for uh, terrestrial based services. In that case, space based services can fill in that gap. But in the near term, at least for the next couple of decades, I don't see any replacement for undersea cables. Space based can provide you a limited amount of redundancy, but it will always be a small, very limited amount. It will not be a large amount.
Limited plus expensive plus the time lag between
Yeah,
the
yeah.
transfer of the information, right? So, sir, you mentioned that we need to encourage private institutions into the undersea cable laying down and their maintenance. Do we have currently any of the big business houses doing that as of now?
Yeah, so we don't have domestic. Otherwise, cable laying, cable maintenance, these are all private companies which are handling it. But they're not domestic companies, they're international companies, they're foreign companies. Yeah.
So none
We
of
need
our
to,
Indian companies like the big names, Adani, Ambani,
no,
Mahindra, Tatas,
no.
none of
Then
them.
they might be owning cables, but they don't have the capacity to lay cables or to repair cables. So therefore, it is imperative that we develop this capability in-house. Tomorrow, if we have, let's say in combat, if we have, an incident of either because of, uh, uh, non-combat reasons, you've had a reason because you had a defect, or because of, someone has come and deliberately interfered with some of your cables. It's going to be extremely difficult when you have a heightened security situation or even war for any other ship to come over here. Then no one is going to come because this is now a combat situation. No one wants to enter a combat zone. So you have to have that domestic capability, you know, that come what may in any situation, I can, with a domestic crew which is qualified to do this job, I can send someone, I can protect them, of course, to make sure that they're protected while they're doing this job. But they can undertake take this job in a reasonably small amount of time and get my critical infrastructure on its feet again. Because these sort of disruptions, can weigh down your economy if it's scaled up to multiple cables at the same time. Yeah.
And majority of these private organizations are based in US.
No, I don't think so.
Some.
To the best of my knowledge, as I mentioned, the cable repair consortiums, the ones that we use, because there's the tyranny of distance. I cannot employ companies which are employing ships, let's say in the Atlantic or the Pacific, etc. You would like to have them, which are employing ships somewhere in the Indian Ocean. So the ones for cables repair, that the consortiums that we use, one is Dubai based and one is Singapore based. So these are the two consortiums for cable repair. Cable laying, they are these global companies. I think a large number of them are European also. Some are Chinese. Some belong to, Southeast Asian countries. Some are American. But we don't have any of our own. So we have to rely on one of these companies to lay our cables.
Very interesting, sir. So, what about the people who are specializing? We don't even have colleges, we don't have institutions to give such kind of a training to our own people, right? They will have to go abroad,
Yeah,
probably either, as you
yeah,
mentioned, China, Singapore, USA, things.
yeah. So I mean, it's a specialized task, and it's not required on scale. Cable laying is not a frequent activity. You might, like I've said, in India, so you got three cables coming up this year. In all our, we've laid hardly any cable. I mean, yeah, 17, 18 cables we've laid. So this is not a frequent activity. So I don't think there's a requirement to put it in, in a college or something. But you have to have some sort of a training institution for maybe a specialized course where a very small number of people are required to undergo this sort of a course. Some of it can also be overseas, because it may not be profitable or worthwhile for you to stand up an entire facility for this specific task. A lot of it can be even OEM based. The makers of these equipment, cable repair equipment, they can meet that training need for you. So when you purchase it, you get trained with them, and when you come back, you start executing this task.
So we need to like develop our own facilities. Sir, I think we should have our own because having your own people, having your own capabilities, having your own institutions, it really makes a lot of difference. Because the
Undoubtedly.
way the things are
Yeah,
moving forward,
yeah,
we are
yeah,
sorry to say, Modi ji said we are
yeah,
not in
mm,
era of war, but I think we are in an era of war. It's totally opposite rather.
yeah.
So
So here, what happens
you
is
don't
that
have.
it's an easy target, because you have a certain degree of deniability when you can do it. It's very difficult to pinpoint, and therefore, it's a vulnerability that needs to be plugged. And if you want to plug that vulnerability, then you have no choice but to develop homegrown capabilities. So it is absolutely essential for us to develop these homegrown capabilities. Sometimes I think the salience of these cables, is outside the public eye, and therefore I think a program of this nature, what you're conducting right now, so that a large amount of public awareness, comes up as what is the critical importance of these cables. I think it's a good thing for the public to be aware of the criticality of this infrastructure.
Agree, sir. Agree. Thank you so much, sir, for joining. Would you like to add to conclude? Would you like to add anything to conclude our discussion?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm glad you've taken this topic because I don't think, as I mentioned earlier, it gets adequate attention. And therefore, it is starting to get now, but there's some lag, I would say, before we can, uh, put things in place. One more thing also I'd like to mention is that let's take a case where you lose multiple cables. Let's say in combat, someone has come and severed multiple cables. You'll soon reach a point where your remaining cables are inadequate to meet your need. They're inadequate because the bandwidth that you need to for the traffic that you're normally having on a day-to-day basis cannot so these cables are going to get overwhelmed. You have to introduce a system of prioritization of traffic also. I mean, we have so many internet services of Netflix streaming and this movie streaming and that, and in the midst of, along with that is going essential financial data, banking data, transactions, etc. So there has to be a means that in case, in the event you have a interruption on a mega scale of data flow, that your critical traffic can be prioritized and made to flow in the whatever infrastructure is left. Some can be through space-based services, and some can be through the remaining cables that are left with you. So we have to develop a system of prioritizing traffic so that there's a pecking order. Is what has to flow, what can be interrupted in a time when you don't have the ability for that to flow. So that's another thing I think that people have to keep at the back of the mind of having a robust system. And this cannot be done. I think actually maybe it's very difficult for a nation to do this in isolation. Maybe there has to be a regional effort or a global effort for this sort of uh, tagging of data as to what is critical and what is not critical.
थैंक यू सो मच सर फॉर ज्वाइनिंग। जाने से पहले सभी व्यूअर से रिक्वेस्ट है, प्लीज लाइक सब्सक्राइब और शेयर करना नहीं भूलिएगा। अगर आप कंट्रीब्यूट करना चाहते हैं तो यूपीआई नंबर स्क्रीन के ऊपर, आप फीडबैक देना चाहते हैं, मुझसे जुड़ना चाहते हैं, कोई टॉपिक रिक्वेस्ट करना चाहते हैं, तो सभी के सभी लिंक्स डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स में। इसी के साथ जय हिंद, जय श्री राम, हर हर महादेव।
Jai
थैंक यू
Hind,
सर।
and thank you, Gayatri, for calling me this event, and I wish your podcast the very best.